But what was so striking to all of us was how much his behavior looked more like that of a serial killer than a mass murderer. I think it's possible that if he hadn't been caught, might have thought about doing it again. Powerful, virile figure who plays out some kind of titillating, psychologically exciting fantasy. Whether he was imitating offenders who did things like that, which I think he was, and studying them privately and at school, or playing out his own, that same type of person will control everything. You can imagine how out of control he must be feeling in prison, and why, he would be compelled to suddenly yank us all back into looking at him and talking about him, and even in theory getting him out of there, because I think the loss of control is a huge problem for this person who is trying to render the world so predictable. Ultimately, one way or another, he always seems to be the puppet master.
Hi, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, you're a clinical and forensic psychologist, and you're an expert in violent crime. And I know you've worked extensively on the Bryan Kohberger case, which we're talking about again today because of the Netflix documentary and also because of his appeal. So just going back, talk to us about what you thought of the motive even before we found out who it was. You had a clue of what may have driven the killer.
Well, before there was an arrest in the Idaho case, Dr. Ann Burgess, with whom I work at Boston College, and Greg Cooper, who was the former head of behavioral science for the FBI, Dean Jackson, who's also in the leadership of the foundation, Chris McDonough, who's a homicide detective in the foundation. We're all members of the Cold Case Foundation, which helps to solve crimes that have gone cold over the years. And we got together to put together a profile of the kind of person that would do this. And at the time, what I was very compelled by was that this was a mass murder with 4 people being killed in the same place at the same time. I had been one of the 2 creators of the Columbia Mass Murder Database. That's the largest study that's ever been done of mass murder. And I knew that the key to profiling a person who's committed a mass murder is the weapon that is used, and be based on statistics. And so based on the fact that a blade was used, I was able to infer a great deal about the kind of person that would have done this. And what jumped out right away was that this was probably going to be an odd, socially outcasted, rigid, mechanical kind of person with sexual frustrations, essentially, who would probably stand out in the setting in which he was operating as putting people off and being a little strange with regard to women. And this turned out to be really quite true of him. But what was so striking to all of us was how much his behavior looked more like that of a serial killer than a mass murderer. And so one of the things that we thought about really from the beginning was that this might have been somebody moving in that direction, where he lost control of the situation and it became something that it wasn't intended to be, right? And so from the start, I was very compelled by the idea that this was somebody who was looking a lot more like that kind of offender. And then as time went on and Kohberger was apprehended and the trial was coming and some information came out about what was on his cell phone, lo and behold, it became clear that there was violent pornography and things that would be typical of somebody who is driven by a perverse fantasy life in which he dominates women or controls women, manipulates them. I do think there is no question in my mind that there probably was one woman in that house who was the center of some kind of obsessional fantasy, but his intel failed him, and it turned unexpectedly into an out-of-control mass murder situation.
And in the documentary, they talked about the incel theory. Can we just talk a little bit about what that means and whether you agree? They said that there wasn't not enough evidence to prove that he is part of the incel movement. What are your thoughts on that?
So the incel theory has to do with the idea that, we think about people like Elliot Rodger, who are young men who are angry at women because they feel involuntarily forced to be celibate, that they're interested, but simply can't get anybody to be interested in them in that way. Now, I had an issue with that from the beginning because Kohberger, we know, was somebody who did have some date experiences. He was just extremely weird on them. For example, the date that he reportedly had where he told the woman that he wanted to tickle her or that she had, nice birthing hips. He was a sort of weird person more than somebody who couldn't get a date. So I don't think of him so much as an involuntary celibate, which is what an incel, means. It's the contraction of those words. I think of him more as a person whose detached, peculiar, mechanical quality and his desire to render relationships predictable, almost like a scientist thinks, weirded people out. You remember, for example, that he would record women in his phone, not with their name, but based on something like, girl I ran with or something
Yes.
like that, or woman I jogged with, so that there's this total mechanical objectification. And I think that this is precisely the kind of person who would have been frustrated that he couldn't make a science out of women and other people and how to get people to like him and so forth. So, of course, if somebody like that, in addition, is willing to be violent, then violence becomes the ultimate solution to how to manipulate somebody into thinking you're great or interesting or desirable or whatever, because you can't do it in the normal way.
Because we watched the documentary, and obviously the families as well. This is the main question that's never been answered. Why? So obviously there's been talk of whether you say rejection, obsession, or just a desire for control. Which one of those things do you think is most likely the true motive?
I think that there was definitely, without any question in my mind, and many experts with whom I've discussed the case agree that the key to this is a kind of psychosexual fantasy in which in the darkness where nobody could see you, right? You come in and you're a powerful, virile figure who plays out some kind of titillating, psychologically exciting fantasy. Whether he was imitating offenders who did things like that, which I think he was, and studying them privately and at school, or playing out his own. The idea is that you completely control and dominate. Remember that one of the pornographic themes for him was women who were asleep. This deeply disturbed me because I am convinced that Kohberger, among the killers that interested him, was Bundy, who was a necrophile. And the idea of a sleeping woman becomes very disturbing because necrophilic individuals, necrophiliacs, will often look for pornography in which people are sleeping because it's a way of getting around not being able to look up deceased people. And the idea of the attraction to sleeping people or a person who's in the darkness like that is very disturbing to me. But I think the point is that you want someone that you completely control, who doesn't fight back, who can't look at you and laugh at you, right? So I think that the sexual element and the pornography leads me to believe there was some of that, was driven by that same need for domination and control. It's just one mechanism of it. That same type of person will control everything. You can imagine how out of control he must be feeling in prison and why, he would be compelled to suddenly yank us all back into looking at him and talking about him and even in theory getting him out of there. Because I think the loss of control is a huge problem for this person who is trying to render the world so predictable.
And as we know, the female victims, they suffered more severe stab wounds and more stab wounds than Ethan, the male victim. So that is, again, backs up that you feel this was about the women and not necessarily the men, although we don't know who the main target was, if there was a main target.
I've always believed that the central figure was Maddie Mogan, and that everyone else was either somebody that he viewed as in the way of what he was attempting to accomplish. So you see extreme fury, somebody trying to fight back or put up an argument. Of course, any woman that tried to wrangle power away from him could bring out some extreme aggression. But I think that Ethan, for him, was almost like, a male interloping into this fantasy, probably someone with whom he would have experienced some jealousy because, he wasn't socially isolated and was there with a woman and all of that. But I also think that he would have seen him as more of a kind of just sort of someone that was an obstacle more than someone that he had any particular passionate rage toward. So I think it would have been more expeditious than it would have been with the women.
So we saw in the documentary that obviously he was studying criminology and that other fellow students talked about how passionate he was in some of these talks. Suddenly he would come to life. Do you think he was trying to get away with the perfect crime? Do you think he was really studying people like that to try and, copy them?
Well, I think that getting away with a crime is another variation on the theme of the dominating and controlling and manipulating people. That's a theme that is present in many ways throughout this case. And I think it's possible there was an element of that, but I think it's ultimately that you don't want to get caught because you'd like to keep doing it. I mean, I have a very strong sense that Kohberger is so much like a serial offender rather than a mass murderer where you do something once and either take your own life or, get incarcerated and that's the end of it. I think this is somebody who was sort of trying to master it and lost control the first time he did it. So I think it's possible that if he hadn't been caught, might have thought about doing it again. And so I think there would have been a lot of studying of the methods of these types of offenders. Whether it's how to gather intel, how to identify a victim that matches your particular fantasy, how to know, when they're home and when they're vulnerable, possible mechanisms of surveillance, electronic surveillance. We don't know what he was doing because there's been such a black box surrounding the entire case. But I have no doubt that everything he did in some way reflected that need for domination and control and manipulation. And as an example of this, I was fascinated by the alibi that was given by Kohberger because he claimed that he was looking at the stars in Wawawi State Park. Now, first of all, on a psychological level, this notion of studying something that you can never touch, the way an astronomer studies a star, but he can't touch it. He'll never touch a star, but he knows everything about them. It's very similar to the way I think this guy would have operated. He was sort of watching these women, knowing everything about them. He probably could tell you things like what hand they use to eat their cereal, that kind of thing. And yet could never be near, right? And when he did, he was destroyed. It exploded. It didn't go the way he wanted, just like what would happen if he touched a star. But even more disturbing, and I remember drawing attention to this at one point, is that Wawawi State Park was the site of the discovery of a body, Joy Page, that was thought to be a Bundy victim. And Bundy was asked about that crime and wouldn't confess to it at the time of his execution. I also thought when you take that in conjunction with him going out to Washington, where Bundy was, to study criminology and other things about like what was found on his phone, made me think that he had a special kind of interest in Bundy among other offenders. So again, I think the idea that like that has never been talked about, that he's never explained, if that was just a complete coincidence, this is just another example of this control mechanism, as is, I think, this attempt at retrial, although certainly people are entitled to try to seek legal recourse. And let's face it, if he is found guilty again, what will he do? Probably write a book or start telling the story to manipulate the public that way. So that I think ultimately, one way or another, he always seems to be the puppet master.
Would you like to see a trial? I know that some of the families have said that, the death penalty would then be back on the table, that they never got a trial. Do you think that that would be a good thing?
Well, it's interesting. It depends who you ask. I mean, for example, one family member whom I happen to personally know said on a program that that it might be interesting to see it backfire on him, where he takes a gamble and winds up with a death sentence.
Exactly. Yeah.
That kind of thing. I mean, I think that, to be honest with you, my sense was that the families were robbed of that kind of process that is necessary. I've worked with many victims of crime that have had to see their family members, stories played out in court and all that. It's just awful. And it's part of the process of it becoming real for you, so that then you can begin to try to understand it and move in some way, if that's even possible, away from it in time, because it's now like the trial ends and the person who did it is in a box somewhere, and you could begin to try to make meaning of it and to heal. And I think that they were robbed of that. One minute they were preparing for it, and the next minute he gets to keep his mouth shut and be off somewhere, and no one has to, hear about the victims and how hideous what he did was. And he doesn't ever have to tell anyone about the embarrassing little dirty world in which he was scheming about this.
What do you think the next steps are going to be? And obviously he's really going to have to prove that his lawyers, he's saying that he was played by his lawyers, basically, and things are not how he expected in prison.
Well, first of all, I'm sure he feels extremely out of control in prison.
Mm-hmm.
I know he's been upset over silly things like not getting the bananas he wants and things like that. And having had, been an invisible person who got a taste of the spotlight and now doesn't have it anymore bothers him, I'm sure. But I also think that there's something so perverse about, first of all, if let's say he gets rid of all his attorneys and he wants to represent himself, that's a little too Bundy-like for my taste. But then he's allowed to have access to all kinds of evidence, and think about the perversion of this person having crime scene photos and information and so forth, so that you almost wonder if in some twisted way there's also an element of reliving.
Right.
And then the family being dragged back and having to listen to it and all of that. So I think there is that piece which strikes me as horrifying. But at the same time, if it's taken seriously, the case will be made and we'll see what happens. Although it is very rare that, you've made a confession and then it's going to be thrown out unless something very hard comes forward to show that you were coerced, like a, DNA completely renders it impossible that you were even there, that kind of thing. I mean, in this situation, the problem you have is the argument is being made like I didn't do it alone. But how are you going to get around the fact that the sheath has that DNA profile on the button and him claiming that he was in the park? I mean, did the sheath with that profile get flown in by a drone? I mean, how did it get in the house? So there's a kind of absurdity factor too. And yet people are entitled to legal recourse. So.
And if he doesn't get a new trial, what do you think would come next after that? Because like you say, he doesn't want people to forget about him in a way. Do you think he would write a book? Do you think he would ever reveal why he did these things?
I think ultimately that he is seeking some mechanism of getting out of that situation. The loss of control, the being driven by whatever drove him in the first place and not being able to play it out. These are very, very powerful forces. I'm sure if there were a way to escape out of there, Bundy-style, he probably would. But I think that loss of control, this is not somebody who's just going to accept it. He'll just keep filing complaints and making a big fuss. And then ultimately, I think we'll start talking, even just to draw attention to what a big victim he is, and getting the newspapers to listen to him and so forth, because there's a kind of parasitic relationship sometimes where you become big news. So you become interesting to people. But the reality is that, you're sitting in prison because you butchered 4 young people and nobody should be looking at you. So I think that gets very, very complicated, but I think he will take full advantage of that because he knows anything he says will be on the front page.
The only thing he seemed to have any care about previously was his family. So I think it's quite shocking that he was going to put his family through this again. Do you think we will hear from them? We haven't heard much from them. I know his sister did speak out briefly.
Well, it's interesting because Kohberger strikes me as somebody that, was really living a double life. I think that's why Bundy and people like Bundy would have been of interest to him. That the Bundy compared the experience of living the secret life as a killer as a gay man that was hiding his identity from his loved ones. And I think there's a little of that going on. You have to picture a person who grew up in a household in which I think it would have been very unsettling to find out that he was looking at the kinds of stuff he was looking at and drawn to the kinds of things he was looking at. And I think it was sort of sublimated into a pro-social thing. I'm interested in crime to fight it. I'm a good guy. I'm on that side of things. And yet, he's fascinated by it in the dark way. There are photos on the phone of him almost cosplaying, with the hood on and the sort of looking like and so there's that sort of attraction to the darkness and to the shadow. And I think that even now there's that kind of controlling the narrative where he doesn't want people to sort of know, what he did and who he is and what he was doing in the shadows. So I think that fragmentation, we don't know what he has said to his family and what they know and all that. I think it's important, because, for this guy, wanting to control the narrative on how he's seen seems so central to the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I thought it was so telling, in this original profile that we did, it was so telling that he did it in the dark with sleeping women, because if in the darkness he was sort of something, but if they looked at him, they would have just thought he was a sort of nothing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.